Rike, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to JSI Europe's Equality and Diversity Task for Empowerment 9th webinar. We are glad to start the fall with Jade Johnson from JSI USA, teaching us more about advocacy from raising awareness, changing policy, influencing behavioral change. Advocacy is an essential tool to create impact on the causes you care about. I am really looking forward to this session and learning more today. But enough from me, over to you, Jay.
All right, welcome everybody. So good to see some names out there that I recognize. I miss you all. I wish we were doing this face to face, but thankfully for the technology gives us the opportunity to connect and to be with each other, even if it is via this virtual world. So today we're going to talk about advocacy and giving voices to the causes that we care about. This is one of my big passions. It is something that I never really realized it, but even as a young person, I often found myself on one side of a cause or another. Sometimes that was advocating to try to get myself out of trouble. Sometimes it was advocating to get myself into trouble. But when we look at advocacy, it can cover a very wide range of different places and opportunities that we can utilize it. So I'm going to share with you some of my different experiences, and just to give you a little bit of background, I have advocated both at the local government level. So I actually even served at the government level from 2012 to 2016. I was a local, essentially city council for a township that had 48,000 residents. Had to advocate on a whole host of different legislative issues or community issues. So had that experience, but I've also advocated at our state level. So at the state of Michigan, we got about 7.5 million people in the state of Michigan. I've advocated on everything from changing laws regarding human trafficking, which was really successful. We ended up getting 17 laws changed in 1 year, actually about 7 months in the process, by building a strong coalition. So to give you a little background on that, the laws oftentimes, especially in Michigan, they were targeting people who were the prostitutes. And if they were picked up, they would go to jail. And the people that were actually trafficking them, they weren't affected by it. And that was absolutely ridiculous. So we advocated and changed 17 laws within our state government, and actually ended up putting proposals into the federal government to have laws changed for the international side of things as well. I've advocated at the federal side for things like Nothing But Nuts, but also for charitable gaming purposes, for health and wellness issues. So I've advocated in terms of health literacy. I've advocated for plain language, which is a concept that is essentially that laws and or regulations should be written in common language that people can understand. So I've been on the side of plain language advocacy. So I've got a lot of experience in advocating to government, but I've also advocated to businesses as well as civic organizations. So I'm going to do my best to try to monitor the chat as we go along here. But if I miss something, please feel free to repost it. I'll double check and kind of keep an eye on it. But there's a lot going on. So I want to get right into this and start looking at advocacy. And this is going to be a little bit interactive. So while I don't have the breakout opportunities that come from Zoom, so we're going to do some of this via chat. And I think we can open up microphones too. Is that right, Rike?
Yes. They just have to ask me.
Perfect. So when we get to some of the conversational pieces, I'll say, hey, this is a time for you to open up your microphones, and you can make the request, so that way we can have a little bit of a back and forth dialogue too. But advocacy, like I said, is one of my passions. I've been advocating, I guess, at the, we'll call it professional level for the better part of 12 years. Again, my name's Jay Johnson. I'm the CEO and master trainer for Coeus Creative Group. Last year, I served as international vice president, assigned to the Nordic countries and Iceland, where a big part of my heart is. And I'm just very, very, very honored to be with you today. So thank you, Savava, for inviting me to do this a long time ago, Enrique, for setting this up. I love the work that you're doing, and it has really transformed even other countries. JCI USA right now is engaged in a diversity council, an inclusion council. We've done all kinds of things, and even some modeling of the efforts that you've done. So excellent work and being advocates for diversity and inclusion. Our company focuses on behavioral intelligence. We do everything as it relates to human behavior. In terms of that, we help people to accurately explain existing behavior, predict future behaviors, influence other people's behavior, obviously important in advocacy, and then control and manage our own behaviors. And we do that because we believe that behavior is truly the core of all success and failures. If you go back and think about any project that you've had that didn't go well, more than likely there was a human behavior or set of human behaviors that may have been dismantling to that project. If you go back and look at one that you were really successful with, you could probably trace back some really positive behaviors or different ways that people behaved that contributed to the overall success. So with behavior being the core of success and failure, we try to help people by improving their behavioral intelligence. So this is going to be one of those moments. I want you to open up the microphone, feel comfortable in doing so. This is a nice, open, conversational space that we are going to do this. You can do this in the chat, or you can request to open the microphone from Rike. And I want to know, though, what do you think advocacy is? If you were to define advocacy for yourself, or what your understanding of advocacy is at this point in time, what would you say advocacy encompasses? Give you a minute to request the microphone or to type in the chat. I can see some people are typing now. This is great. Carl had said, I can't request the mic. Where might we be able to do that, Rike?
Can you send me the request? Or in the chat?
In the chat, send that to Rike, which is good. So let's get this and fix this.
Carl, your mic should be on now.
Carl, coming in live from Norway. Where are you at, brother? Well, we try to get that set up. So giving voice to an issue that you are passionate about, raising voices of marginalized groups. That's an answer from Savava. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. That's a huge part of advocacy, giving voice and raising voices. Anyone else? Give it just a minute. All right. Well, hopefully we can get that going and figure that part out. Carl, are you with us?
I think so, maybe.
There we go. Yes, sir. You're on.
Well, it's like what we also did last year is to say that we stand up for the people that need a helping hand during the conferences to provide those safe rooms.
Yeah.
Or safe people.
So, providing safe groups, safe spaces, providing safe places for conversations, that can all be a part of creating that diverse and inclusive area. And the fact that we were promoting that, pushing that, and making that something that was real inside of the conferences, that was an effect of our advocacy actually coming into implementation. So that's great. Yes, thank you. Anyone else? All right, so let's get a working definition, because there's a couple of things that I want to talk about here in terms of advocacy and how it's actually even broader than we may necessarily think. So advocacy is an activity by an individual or group which aims to influence decisions within political, economic, social systems and institutions. Advocacy assumes that there's a problem and that needs to be changed, and it's a powerful way to drive and affect that change. So one of the things that's very, very popular in the United States, for example, is having patient advocates. So for example, if I have a aging parent that may not be able to advocate on behalf of their own medical situation, I might be an advocate for that parent. So I would advocate on behalf of them to make sure that they are, getting that they're getting different treatments, or that they're getting opportunities to experience, the right forms of medical procedures and things like that. I could also advocate to a corporation. Maybe a corporation has huge pollution challenges, and my advocacy campaign could be me trying to advocate or bring awareness to that or highlight that. So there's some impacts of advocacy that we're going to talk about, but ultimately it's an individual group that are seeking some kind of change, and that change can be social, political, corporate, financial, any of those. So advocacy really encompasses ideally making a pitch, being persuasive about it, and essentially changing something that's a problem. So as we kind of move forward from there, let's talk about first, why is this important? Because I always start with why, much like Simon Sinek. I think that once we get the why, that really gives us the motivation and a drive to sort of perform these endeavors. So first, raising awareness and education. One of the mistakes that we as human beings make in many cases is we feel like other people might, sometimes we know this is not true, but sometimes when we have something that we are passionate about, we make an assumption. We believe that other people are passionate about it as well, or all they have to do is just hear about this and they're going to become passionate about it as well. But that's actually, it's sort of a cognitive bias that we have. The issues that we become passionate about or that are interesting to us are not always necessarily interesting to the broader scope of the world. But when we bring awareness and when we bring education on a lot of issues, one of the things that we're doing is we are actually changing individual behaviors. So for example, one of the things that was completely underrepresented, people had no idea. When we were doing this human trafficking thing, we made it very, very personal. We ended up going into local municipalities. Now, I come from a suburban township just outside of Detroit. Okay, Detroit's a major city. People would think, okay, maybe there's human trafficking situations or problems or challenges in the city of Detroit, but not in my township, not here in Redford Township, because it's a small, tight-knit community. People know each other. But in reality, what we ended up finding through our research was that there was actually 3 different motels that are within our jurisdiction that had problems with human trafficking rings. And no one really knew that. No one had an idea. Like, I assumed that people would just know that, yes, this is a problem in every community. This isn't just a problem in big cities or at big events. That was a mistake. That was a cognitive bias on my part. Because when I started having conversations with local elected officials and local leadership, they were blown away by, this is a problem in our own community. So when we think about raising awareness and raising education, that's a huge impact that we can do through advocacy. Second, just like Savava had said, giving voice to the voiceless. In many cases, we have points of privilege, or if you're familiar with Robert's Rules of Order, you know the concept of point of privilege. That gives you the floor to speak. In the real world, people don't get to say point of privilege and actually have their voice heard. And when we think about that, we as a speaker or somebody that maybe has this space or a safe space to utilize our voice, we can give that voice to the others. I want to be very careful here, though, to make sure that we don't necessarily assume the idea of speaking for others. For example, giving a voice to the voiceless, I can use my voice to maybe prop up or to be a good ally for women in the workplace. But if I am personally speaking on behalf of women, I'm not actually opening up space for women to speak on their own behalf. So giving voice doesn't necessarily mean that I am speaking for somebody. It means that I'm amplifying their voice or helping them to create a space for their own voice. Highlighting individual or group concerns. In many cases, advocacy can be very personal. So we can be advocating on behalf of our own health. We could be advocating on behalf of our own job safety. So if you think about it, if you're in a place of employment and maybe you're being asked to do something that is questionably safe, say, for example, you're working in a place that doesn't have good air circulation right now, going to your boss or going to your leadership and advocating to say, we need new HVAC systems or we need new ventilation systems, that is a form of advocacy. And that can be very individualized, but it can also be group, it can highlight a group concern as well. Asbestos in the US, absolutely. So asbestos, a huge problem. Everything was asbestos pre-1980s. And there are schools with asbestos in it. And we actually, ironically enough, we did an advocacy project for with the Environmental Protection Agency regarding education in the United States. And we generated a $300,000 US grant to abate an entire school district of the asbestos that was installed previously. So that's an example of where advocacy at the federal level generated like real dollars. And it took us maybe 3 or 4 months to build our case for why the EPA should be giving us this grant to do that. So great point, Carl. Absolutely. Safeguarding rights. This is a place where we often think about advocacy. So we think about advocating on behalf of the downtrodden or somebody whose rights are being taken away. But it's not always necessarily just the people whose rights are being taken away. It's also the advocacy of safeguarding future rights or safeguarding the rights that have not even yet been given yet. So that's something that we can look at in advocacy. And I'm going to give you a real clear example of that as we sort of move forward. Advocacy is one of those things that inspires people. And if you have to look no further than Greta to see how many people have been inspired by her message, have joined her cause, have helped to amplify her voice when it comes to something like the environment. When we have an outspoken leader, even think back to like Martin Luther King and the original civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. You know, Dr. King became somebody who inspired millions of people to take to the streets. Now, this is pre-social media. This is pre-email. This is like literally newspaper and word of mouth. And that's functionally what you have. And building a coalition of millions of people at that point in time tends to show how powerful it is when we become a truly passionate advocate for specific causes or in a way that we want to address different challenges that we might be facing. Advocacy is also a great avenue to build coalitions. In every single one of the instances where I have had a successful advocacy campaign, it was by building coalitions that amplified the voices. In places where my advocacy campaigns were not as effective, it was when the opposition had a larger coalition than we did. And I'm going to give you an example of that. In one of the cases, we have a really unique fundraising mechanism for nonprofit organizations in the United States. We can run poker rooms or game nights, almost like Vegas nights, where we as the nonprofit can take in 60% of any of the things that are going on in these poker rooms, which is a great fundraiser. And then an organizing committee gets the other 40%. Well, the casinos didn't like that because we were drawing customers away from the casinos and everything else. So when you have that kind of dichotomy, the casinos put a lot of pressure on the local electeds. And when the casinos put the pressure on the local electeds, they started to shut down all of those different things. Now, there was a lot of nonprofits that were reliant on that money. And regardless of where you stand on gambling or anything else like that, this was really about funding mechanisms for the nonprofits. So we started an advocacy campaign to protect the nonprofits. And in this case, what ended up happening was the casinos were just excessively large and they outshadowed our voice, they outshadowed our funding, and it was not a successful campaign. But what we were able to get out of that was an opportunity to have conversations with some major corporations inside of the state of Michigan, many of which that ended up supporting the nonprofits even after this situation went away. So that's an example of being flexible, which we'll also talk about. Building coalitions is one of those things where if I'm standing there and I'm yelling out the message, screaming it from the mountaintop, I'm one voice. But if I have Savava join me, now we're two and we're going to be just a little bit louder. And if I have all of you join me, now we're going to be 19 and we're going to be even louder. And if we can reach out and start getting other organizations or other corporations to join in our efforts, when we did the human trafficking here in Michigan, we had built a coalition of over 113 different organizations. And we all were testifying with the same message, the same vision. And that was really powerful. And at that point in time, things changed, and it changed much quicker. Evolving policies, procedures, and process. So every policy, one of my favorite policies, I'm going to tell you this, one of my favorite policies was in the JCI Michigan bylaws was you are not allowed to shoot guns. And yes, I am from the United States, so please forgive our gun culture, but you're not allowed to shoot guns, set off fireworks, or blow things up in the election cycle for a JCI position. And I'm like, you know, that policy exists because somebody did that in the past. But when we think about changing policies, when we think about doing something, those policies oftentimes have some form of resistance. Somebody put those policies into place, somebody put those procedures into place, and they believe in them. So advocacy then is almost like a truth finding. It's a form of democratic debate, discussion, where you're advocating a specific position, and that may be in opposition to somebody else who's advocating the contrary. The other issue with advocacy, and this is one of my favorite things about it, and I have literally seen this happening inside of JCI USA. JCI USA, as many of you may know, we're a very individualistic culture. We can be isolationist. It can have a huge impact on our global relations. But one of the things that I've started to notice is since we've adopted advocacy as one of our mainstays, a lot of our members are thinking more globally. They're thinking even if just in North America right now, or the Americas, now we're starting to think about, well, how does this policy affect Europe? How does this policy affect Asia? How does it affect Africa? So when we start thinking about advocacy, it takes no further looking than something like George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd is something that has created a global advocacy movement. So the issues in one country are oftentimes echoed in other countries. The challenges that we face as a society are similar challenges that other societies face. So in focusing on advocacy, we're actually creating more of a collectivist we culture rather than just a me culture. So, and Savava, I see that comment. I've seen this lobbying for my work. It can also be a challenge if you're collaborating with other NGOs who do not share the full vision with you, but align on certain topics. That's a great point. So when you're building a coalition, one of the things that we need to do is make sure that you have scope, okay? Like, for example, there has been different points in times where we have built coalitions with people that we would probably not have built coalitions before. Maybe not necessarily because we're ideologically opposed, but maybe because we're just in completely different arenas. But there's one small piece that we can come together on that we both share a passion for. But defining that scope and making sure that we stay on point with that advocacy in that scope is critical. Otherwise, yes, you can see it because one group tries to pull it one way, one group tries to pull it a different way. So that's one of the things that you definitely want to establish when you're building coalitions. It's a great point, Savava. Thank you. So enacting sustainable change, which is something that many of us are passionate about. We want to enact some kind of change that has an impact and that it's going to be sustainable. If you've been on a JCI board, you've probably enacted some kind of changes. And if you've been around long enough, you've been there long enough to see those changes go out the window at some point. And there's a piece of us that, a little piece of us that feels like it dies, especially if you're a chairperson of the board and you're like, hey, I did all these things. And then all of a sudden, 1 year to lead, next year somebody comes in and changes it. It's like, oh, why did it all change? But When we think about sustainable change, especially for rights, especially for societal good, especially for laws or policies and procedures, we want to make sure that we build a strong enough advocacy case that it has longevity, that it's not something that we have to continuously go back year after year after year and advocate for, but something that essentially changes a culture or changes an ideology. And there's ways to do that through the following techniques. So let's utilize the chat function in this case. We're not going to do this with a partner because we would normally break out and give you the opportunity, but I want to hear a little bit, what is a cause that you care about? So what is a cause or some kind of area that you would want to be an advocate for? Just curious. So, pick one or two and toss those into the chat. And let's see where everybody lands, because my guess is that there's going to be some overlap, or there's going to be some opportunities for collaboration in this question. So I'm really curious, and this will also help me to frame some ideas and some best practices if I know some of the different topic areas that you're interested in, and maybe give you some ideas for how to specifically enact some of these best practices as we go forward. So I see a bunch of people typing. We'll give you a second, kind of sort through this. Let's see. See if I can grab that. Excellent. Seeing some of these things come in. All right. Good morning from New Zealand. Hi, Narain. Great to see you. Passionate about equity and inclusion. Fantastic. Obviously, that's something that is truly a passion for me too. Our company is actually being nominated right now for a diversity and inclusion award for advocating essentially on behalf. We've been going around and doing trainings on understanding white privilege, understanding our positions of power in the world, and so on and so forth. So I love that. I'll definitely incorporate that. Protection of forests, not just the Amazon, but also right here in Germany and Europe. Thank you, Maria. Absolutely. Environmental protections, huge. And, it's very, very unfortunate that the leadership of my country right now has backed off a ton of environmental protections. It's so frustrating to me. So that's something that is, I've been supportive of different advocacy organizations here. Mental health, huge, Savava. We actually just in JCI USA created a mental health committee to try to create advocacy policies for mental health, access to mental health care. And yes, it is definitely a social and human rights issue. Absolutely. Inclusion and diversity and sustainability. Beautiful. Thank you for that, Valerie. Carl, allowing people that want to do something to go out and do it. So that's an empowerment type advocacy. Love that. See some others here. Katie, creating psychologically safe workplaces with a highly productive culture where everyone is a great place to work. Thank you for that. Human rights and equity. Yep. Equal opportunities for all people. Love it. Love it. Equal career opportunities for men and women in the business world, and along with initiating change in society as well. These are all critical advocacy opportunities. And as you may have noticed, there's some crossover here. So there's different things that I'm passionate about. And remember, one of the things that I'm going to share with you is if you want to be successful in advocacy, the more people that you can inspire to join into your voice is going to have one of the biggest impacts. So yes, I agree with that, Savava. We're going to see these things come to fruition in our lifetime. I believe it. Parental leave for both parents. That's a really interesting thing. That's a huge problem here in the United States as well. And the way that we do family medical leave. Absolutely. Allowing everybody to be themselves and not trying to fit everybody in the same box. Beautifully said. And that gets into psychological safety. That gets into diversity, LGBTQIA and rights around the world. Lovely. So These are things that you're passionate about. These are really helpful. Thank you. So, and I actually share a lot of your passions, actually virtually every single one of these, with things that I have either advocated on in the past, continue to advocate on, and I want to empower us to be able to do that very, very effectively. So here we go. The first thing that I want you to think about is what makes your issue important. Okay, so you've probably had this thought, you've probably had some reflection, but this is going to be really, really critical for our later stages when we're developing our persuasive messages or our influence messages. When we think about why does something matter to me personally? I want you to go deeper. This is a place where you do a little of the 5 whys. You know, you kind of walk yourself back, you go deeper and deeper and deeper. Why is rights important to you? And when you answer, well, because I believe that it's something that's important. Well, why is that important? Why is it important? Because from a human being, and we're going to get into the cognitive neuroscience, there's a part of our brain that really only cares about yourself, and that's the limbic system. So behavioral intelligence is built on psychology, neuroscience, and communication. We do know that the limbic system is very internal focused. It wants us to survive. It wants us to have the advantages. We want the best food. We want the most resources, the strongest huts, so we can survive and evolve. Once all that's taken care of, then we can get outside of that. But our brains have evolved over the course of time. And now we know that we are better collectively, that regardless if I have the best foods, if other people are eating, it's a more peaceful society. It's a more safe society, right? So we need to think about that in terms of diversity. And I know this is sometimes this is a little, bear with me as I talk about this, because this can be a little bit of a statement that people don't like. The human brain is actually not wired for diversity. There's a really fantastic book called Sapiens, and it's by Dr. Yuval, and it's just an absolute brilliant look at 300,000 years. And yes, you heard that number right. 300,000 years of the human existence. Human beings have been on this planet for 300,000 years. Now, when we think ancient history, we think 10,000 years ago. But the evolution of ourselves and like the actual trying to survive in this world has really codified different aspects of our neurobiological evolution. We live in a world very different than 300,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 300 years ago, 30 years ago, 3 years ago. We live in a different world now. And our brain is still adapting to that world and that evolution change that happened much quicker than biological evolutionary change. Jana, I'm glad somebody else has read that. It's great, fantastic book. If you haven't read it, Sapiens, beautiful book. But we know cognitively, our smart brain, our rational, logical, thinking brain knows that there's a value to diversity, that everyone should have the right to education, that everyone should have the right to eat, that everyone should have the right to be safe, to be psychologically safe, that they should enjoy those rights. That's our rational, logical thinking brain. So that is actually in contradiction to our selfish, evolutionary, limbic system brain. Congratulations for looking at the larger world in a logical and rational way. But now we have to ask why. Because if you don't have an answer to your own why and backing it up, why, you're going to have a tough time convincing people that do not share that cognitive, rational, logical, neocortex thinking that you do. We have to understand what it is that really gets you motivated and passionate about that. Once you have that, influence becomes easier. And then we can do the same thing for community and for country. Why is rights important for our community? Why is the forest and environmental degradation? Why should we advocate? Why does that matter to my community? Why does that matter to my country? And we start looking for those answers. That's going to help us to build our case and our influence messages. Okay. So once we get through that question, we're not going to spend too much time on there today, but I want you to start thinking about that in terms of how do you build out your advocacy planning. So from here, We're going to do the who, what, when, where, why. Who should you be advocating to? Because I could advocate for rights to every single one of you, but my guess is I'm speaking to the choir. And at that point in time, we're probably not necessarily going to get anywhere. Because if we're all in agreement, well, then I'm not advocating to the right person. Should I be advocating to business? Should I be advocating to government? Should I be advocating to citizens? Should I be advocating to nonprofits? Where am I going to do that? Okay, so here's an example. Government, that's actually me a long time ago, right after I stopped playing hockey and was a little bit, still eating like a hockey player. I had to relearn that, but that's me out in front of Capitol Hill when we were actually advocating on federal protections for environmental concerns. The middle one is a women's empowerment, was a women's empowerment advocacy. We ran a project where we did women's self-defense, and then everybody there ended up signing letters for talking about different issues for women in the workplace and advocating on behalf of them. And then the one on the right-hand side, that image is society. That was the Senior Citizens Club and advocating for protective rights because there are Social Security challenges and Social Security issues that a lot of seniors face in the United States. So that was actually bringing all of them together to get them into a letter writing campaign to send those off. So we need to know who the audience is. Are we advocating to government? Are we advocating to businesses? Are we advocating to society in general? Because that's going to help determine our message too. When should we advocate? Okay. Tying it to values. Savava, go ahead and open up your microphone if you can. What do you mean tying it to values? Let me just make sure I understand that. I think you can join me up here. Yeah. There you are.
Hi. So what I was thinking is when lobbying for a cause, and instead of going to the rational thought of it makes sense, you can tie it to money or to the GDP for the country or whatever, you can tie it to a value that, let's say, the municipality or the country in general believes that they stand for. And if you believe that this is a value that is of importance, then you are standing with this actual cause because it's fair or it's just, or we never leave anyone behind or something to that effect, if it makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm getting it across in a first way, but yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's a big part of those asking questions and kind of walking back from there, because when we think about it and we say, okay, what are the values of a country? Well, in many cases, you're going to have a lot of different values that are emergent, right? Like, for example, you may have some people that truly value the environment, and then a different set of competing values might be economic prosperity. Well, sometimes those two core values, while an entire country might value both of those things, they might come to odds with each other. And that's where we see, like, okay, well, we're going to build new buildings and new things, and that's going to produce more jobs. But what's the cost of that? More carbon emissions, more impact on soil, or more impact on air. So when we pull back on those values and asking those questions, why, what we're actually doing is arming ourselves with arguments to be able to appeal to the value systems of the people that we're advocating to. So the current problem with the society is the biggest of all values for decision makers and elites still seems to be money. And that's why you hear things like the business case for diversity. That's exactly right. So why did we make the business case for diversity? Isn't it just something that everybody should value? Yep. But at the same time, some people will say, yeah, it's really important, but at the same time, how am I supposed to do that? It's more expensive for me to hire a diverse workforce. It's harder for me to do that. I've done everything that I could to hire a diverse workforce. So that's really trying to change that mentality and show people, and that's exactly right, Bart. We have to change that because in some cases it's a huge challenge because it's harder to do some of these things that are right. It's harder to do economic prosperity in a green and friendly way sometimes, not always, but sometimes. So that's why we want to make sure that we're capitalizing on multiple value systems. So when there are competing values, we can draw those people in together. So it's a great point, Sababo. When, okay. Now, interestingly enough, when we did the human trafficking advocacy, it happened to be an election year for one of the houses of the state. And one of the things that we did when we went into some of the different senators and some of the different legislators that we were talking to was we said, hey, we know that this is an election year. You know, as different communities start to find out that human trafficking is a major challenge in the district that you serve, wouldn't you like to appear to be one of the people that's advocating for this, or that's carrying on this cause, or that's trying to root that out in your community? We utilized a specific time frame that we can actually take and get change. If I'm advocating to a business and I'm asking them to change their practices, maybe I'm asking them to change their environmental practices, when is the right time to go to them? Is it during the time that they're maybe in their busiest cycles? Probably not. That's probably not going to have the same level of impact. If I'm going to citizens and I'm advocating on behalf of the environment, and we're in the middle of a global pandemic, well, maybe that's not necessarily going to be at the top of their mind at that point in time. But if I'm going to citizens in the middle of a global pandemic and I'm advocating for something such as mental health awareness, education, wellness, well, now those two health things are related. Advocacy has really picked up on diversity and inclusion since the murder of George Floyd, because that issue that created a when moment, and that moment has generated some change already, but it continues to see change and protests and advocacy campaigns that are going on. So we need to think about when is the best time to advocate. We can identify time by a calendar. We can do it by current events. This is thinking strategically, so I don't mean to be insensitive about it, but one of the best times to do an advocacy campaign on a cause that you care about is when there is a catastrophe that has that's oftentimes the nudge that somebody needs to take it seriously. And that's incredibly unfortunate. And I wish that that wasn't the case. But a lot of times our change comes from when those catastrophes occur. So for example, there was huge flooding with some of the different hurricanes that had come in the past. There was advocacy groups that were pushing for more resources to FEMA. Well, they weren't getting anywhere. And then Hurricane Katrina hit years ago, and it completely flooded that basin and really had a devastating impact. And then at that point in time, more resources were given to FEMA because the advocacy campaigns hit the timing at that point in time. Now, they've been sort of shrunk, so it wasn't necessarily sustainable, but that's an example of current events. And then expirations. If we know that there's human beings, the way that our brain, yes, re-election times are exactly right. One of the best times to advocate with government. If we know that we're about to lose something, and that there's a point in time that if we don't do something, we're going to lose something, that's actually very impactful to our psychological awareness. So human beings actually hate losing stuff even more so than they like gaining things. So in one of those aspects, expirations, if we know that if we don't do something now, right this very minute, this opportunity is going to be lost. That can be a very compelling argument for urgency and action, which is also one of our influence mechanisms. So again, this would be with your partner, plan through some of your advocacy or passion. But what I want to do is I want you to think about, going back to what you're passionate about, where do you think, what is one of your primary audiences that you think that you should maybe look at your advocacy campaign? Is it government? Is it education and awareness to citizens? Is it education and awareness, or is it policy change? Is it who do you think is your target of advocacy? And all of the above is an appropriate answer, but I want to say, who are you going to go to first? So go ahead and use the chat function. What are your thoughts on who you should be advocating to? And I'll give you a more specific application. Let's take forests. Let's take deforestation. Who should we be advocating to in terms of deforestation? So jump in there on the chat. Let's see what you say. Governments, people buying fancy furniture, government. Okay. Any others? Any other thoughts on that? Private companies. See a couple people posting here. Consumers of meat, coconut oil, etc. Farmers. Now we're looking at it, right? So oftentimes, I love this. This is a great example of this because a society, as we start to go through this, we realize we can have multi-prong approaches. Each one of these requires a different advocacy message. I'm going to give you an example of an environmental message that sort of fits this, okay? On the East Coast of the United States in Maryland, they have what they call crab culture. Crab is a delicacy. It is in all of the restaurants. Like, people love their crab cakes, crab sandwiches, crab, you name it. They love their crab. So one of the things that was happening was there was dumping offshore. There was different kinds of pollution that was actually having a huge impact on that entire coastline. They tried don't pollute messages. They tried, this is our town messages. They tried this, they tried that, and so on and so forth. And none of this was working. So what did they do? They went to the people and they ran a campaign called Save the Crabs and Then Eat Them. And it was wildly successful because now you've tapped into a core of people that have a vested interest. If we don't do something to save the crabs right now, your crab cakes are gone. This is not going to be available to you. So if I go to random Joe person that doesn't know anything about deforestation and I say, we need to save the trees. Why? We have to be able to connect to them the way that this campaign did to its people. We have to show them how this really affects that individual, that person, and how they can do something about it. So that was a big part of that advocacy. Let's switch gears. We'll do one more. If we were to advocate for, let's do equity in education. Who could we be advocating to? So equitable distribution of education, giving everyone the opportunity. Who could we be advocating to? Government, absolutely. Who else? University, teachers. Yep, loving this. Yep, very good. So as we're seeing these different things, other parents from other social groups, absolutely. When we think about our advocacy, we need to plan out who are these different audiences. It's just like anything else. When we think about teaching, we want to make sure that we know our audience. When we think about sales, we want to know our audience. When we think about negotiations, we want to know our audience. It's the same thing with advocacy, and a plan goes a lot farther than just being passionate. Passionate will get you somewhere, but a plan and being passionate is something that's going to be inspiring because you're giving people a roadmap. You're telling them how we're going to do this, when we're going to do this, who we're going to do this with, and how we're going to affect that change. All right. So now let's get to the real meat of things for you. Strategies. This is the important part. We need to figure out, how do we affect behavioral change? Interestingly enough, so when we create persuasive message, we can create persuasion that changes mindsets. We can create persuasion that changes attitudes. We can create changes that change beliefs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it changes behavior. That's a fascinating thing with human beings. We can believe that alcohol consumption is not something that is great for our bodies. We can have an attitude against alcohol consumption. We can know in our hearts that we shouldn't do something that is poisonous to us on some level, but we still have a cocktail or we still have a drink, and you can replace alcohol with anything else. That could be high fructose corn syrup, sugary treats. That could be desserts. That could be anything. We still do it. We can have a belief system, but our behavior is one of the most challenging things. These advocacy strategies will help to change behaviors. So, developing your brand, authenticity. If you're advocating for something, say I'm advocating for rights, and you come to find out that I treat my employees just terribly, and I enforce all kinds of mandates on them, and I don't give them any kind of time off or anything else like that. Immediately, that gives your opposition the single thing that it needs to dismiss your advocacy campaign. You have to develop your brand, and you need to think about how that functions, okay? So small things, when people are trying to oppose your advocacy, they're going to look for the small things. For example, one of the biggest things, and this was something that was talked about in terms of JCI and its environmental sustainability. Well, you have this sustainability, but you run these massive events that's inconsistent with each other. And I know JCI Europe did a lot of work last year and continue to do work on environmentally sustainable events. And we've been promoting that, and that's continued. That's been an advocacy that's actually had an impact and changed within the organization. Now, there's a long way to go on that, but that is developing now an authentic brand. But when we think about authenticity, if I'm sitting there and advocating to not engage in smoking or drinking, and then you catch my Facebook and I'm have a beer and I'm sitting by a campfire with a beer in my hand, that's immediately going to kill my brand identity. So when we look at being authentic and developing our brand, we need to make sure that we're living the brand of advocacy that we want to live. Getting broad-based support, okay? If one person, you've probably all seen the leadership video at this point in time with the one person who's out there just dancing and having fun at the concert, and people are kind of watching and videoing and kind of snickering, and then the second person comes in, and then the third person comes in, and then all of a sudden 10 people come in, and then more people come in, and now what was immediately, or at least from the thing, something that was totally strange, everyone was doing it. That is the movement building capacity of the psychological concept. Yeah, the first follower, exactly, Carl. It's a psychological concept of social proof. There's been numerous psychological studies of how impactful this is on our behaviors. There's a great study that in New York City, they actually had to stop the study in the middle of it, but in New York City, a sociology group went out. There was two people, and they went out to the corner of New York City, and they were looking up and pointing at the sky. There was nothing there. It was a clear blue sky, but they're looking up and pointing. And within a short amount of time, another person comes over and looks up, and they're talking, and then another person. And then the traffic started to stop. People started to get out of their cars, and they're looking, and people in windows and high rises, they're all leaning out the window looking. We model other people's behavior. The more that we have, if you've ever gone to like a dance club and you walk in and there's 3 people there, immediately you're like, oh, I made a bad choice. I need to go to a different club. If you walk in and the place is packed, elbow to elbow, despite the fact that that could be more uncomfortable, you're excited because, wow, I'm in this with this larger group of people. Pre-COVID, of course. Consider the audience perspective. This is where we're going to take a concept called tactical empathy. Now, don't confuse empathy with sympathy or compassion. Tactical empathy is really getting in to understand where the other person is coming from. So as we start to think about things like political stances, or if there's an opposition party. Getting to think like them is one of the most critical aspects that you can do. So I am a Democrat, or a liberal, as you would call it in the United States. When I ran for elected office, one of the things that I would do when I was talking to somebody of the more conservative or the more Republican party is I would identify myself as a business owner. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with any of you on the social aspects, but at least we have this common ground, because I know that business ownership and economic prosperity and those types of things are important to you. So instead of trying to espouse what I would want to convince them, because I'm not going to change a Republican to a Democrat overnight, I have to do that incrementally. I have to get them to agree with me on one thing and then get them to agree with me on a second, or even build trust in that dialogue so we can continue those conversations. That's the critical thing. When we use tactical empathy, what we're actually doing is thinking, how is the other person going to respond to this? What are they going to think? I'll give you an example of non-tactical empathy. When we were advocating for nothing but nets at the federal level, we were partnered with somebody from the Nothing But Nets organization. And I was leading some of the advocacy, and I was in there and I was having a conversation. And the person, this was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. I'm not joking. Like I literally giggle right now, just thinking about it. But they had this like this cup. And it was this plastic cup, because Americans love plastic way too much. But anyways, it was this plastic cup with the Nothing But Nets logo on it, like a little swag piece. And inside of it was a little net. Now, if you're not familiar with Nothing But Nets, $10, you get a mosquito net that goes to a family. The mosquito net covers their bed. It literally saves lives in places where mosquitoes and malaria are prevalent. Okay, so $10, you can literally like house a family in one of these mosquito nets. So the United States federal government actually puts millions of dollars towards this program for Africa. And what we are doing is advocating for the continuation of that funding and program. So we're in there and we're talking to a congressional person, and we're having this great conversation, telling them, and they're like, wow, I didn't realize even at the Congress level, they voted on this year after year after year to continue that appropriation. Having a conversation with the senator was like, I didn't know that that's what that was for, and what the impact of that was. So the colleague that we had slides over this cup that has a piece of net in it, and the senator takes it and they pull it out and they're like playing with the net and looking at it, and they're like, yeah, every one of those nets have a pesticide that's applied to it, and so on and so forth. And like the look on this senator's face, like all of a sudden the color started running out. Like, you just gave me a net that has pesticides all over it that I'm sitting here and playing with. That was an example of maybe you should probably think about what the impact is going to be of somebody that, if they're going to react to something like, I don't know, chemicals on the piece of thing that you're giving them. There was no chemicals on there, but it just wasn't thinking about it from the other person's perspective. So we need to make sure that we're trying to say, how is this going to be perceived? Not by somebody like me, but by the people that I'm advocating to. It's a critical aspect. And this is honestly where a lot of advocacy campaigns fall apart, because we believe that how could anyone else not feel like this or not think this way? And the unfortunate truth is sometimes they don't. And we have to think like them in order to influence them. And it's critical to influence them. Make issues local and personal. If it's not relevant, no action is going to be taken. When we think about making an issue local and personal, this is a great example. This is a great example of where we do that why analysis and come back. Why is it important for me? Why is it important for my community? And why is it important for my country? When we do that analysis, it gives us the ammunition for this strategy. So for example, I had already mentioned when we did the human trafficking, identifying that it was actually occurring in my community in order to get to my community leaders to actively engage in it. When we advocated for water sustainability programs in our local municipality, one of the things that we did was we requested the data for how much water waste usage was. And then what we did was we showed by installing a rain collection barrel on the different homes, we could actually save every resident more than $50 every single year. So the installation of this rain barrel is going to save you money. Whether they care about the environment or not wasn't necessary. I don't care. I care about the environment. I want them to enact this water sustainability program. How can I advocate it to them? By making the issue local and personal. You're wasting money. This is happening in our township. And that's something that's absolutely critical to getting your point across to people that may not necessarily share your passion or feelings on a subject. Tie your cause to related events, any opportunity that you have. So one of the things that we saw, and this is really interesting when you see intersections. If you're not familiar with what I mean by intersections, we have the murder of George Floyd, which has prompted protests, and it has prompted all kinds of questions of racial bias, privilege, and structural racism and systemic racism and everything else. One of the things, and large advocacy groups in the United States have been pushing that minority groups don't have the same access to healthcare. They don't have the same access to mental health resources. Well, now we have this George Floyd situation, plus we have a global pandemic. The numbers in the United States don't lie. Minority groups, Native American groups, Hispanic groups, they're all severely more affected. Their communities are severely more affected than any other communities in the United States. So we have this racial issue that's created, this health issue that's related, and that organization jumped on it and said, look, if we tie these two things together, our voice gets amplified right now. So they were able to cross-apply an intersection of both race and health to be able to advocate for their position effectively. What's going on in your community? What's going on in your country? What's going on in your general circles or your nonprofit circles that are relevant conversations that are currently happening that you can tie your advocacy to? How can you advocate for your cause and utilize some of those current events? Because now your voice is getting amplified by the larger framing of what's happening in the community, rather than just your voice here. Okay, so it's a really, really powerful strategy for you to be able to get into the mainstream media, to the mainstream publics with your message. Emphasize the value to the target. Okay, so what's in it for them? We need to think about this, because when we're advocating for something, we often, especially in government, this is why advocating during elections is a great time to advocate. What's in it for you? You appear to be somebody who is passionate about rights, and 60 to 70% of your district is engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement. That's an easy sell. So right now, we're advocating for additional training on diversity and inclusion to public safety all around Southeast Michigan. And we know that we just went through a primary election and we have a larger election coming up. So now we have influencers at the top level that are pushing for this initiative because maybe they believe in it, maybe they're passionate about it. That's great. That means that we're aligned and they're going to continue to push after this. But as of right now, what I need them to do is to start implementation of these things. So that's a really powerful way to say, this is something that you're going to want to make sure that you're doing because your constituents want this. And you're elected to represent your constituents, correct? Of course you are, regardless of what value you get for yourself. Yeah, okay. That's a great point, Carl. Carl had posted in here, talk about how different organizations use the Ice Bucket Challenge for their benefit, but forgetting the ASL is the reason for the campaign. And the funny thing is if you go back and you ask people, what was the Ice Bucket Challenge for? A lot of them won't be able to identify ASL. They'll actually say it was for some kind of cause or whatever else. But yes, movements often get co-opted. Okay, that is actually something very well rooted in political and social movement theory, is that at some point in time, different actors and agents get themselves involved into different campaigns, whether it's to bring awareness, education, or anything else. One of the critical things to do and to protect against something like that is to ensure that whatever the advocacy or whatever the awareness campaign is, that there is a way to tie your brand, your authentic brand, into that. So if the ASL was to go back and do the ice bucket challenge again, it may be something to say that something simple. It could be something as simple as you have to say these words, right before you do it, or you have to add this hashtag to it, or you have to do this in order for it to stick, and so on and so forth, to make sure that the brand stays consistent across all of the different organizations that adopt the behaviors that you want. So it's a great point, Carl. Thank you. All right. So as we move forward here, know your facts. One of the worst executed advocacy campaigns that I have ever seen was done by an organization inside of our local municipality. And they came to the township board, and this is while I was serving. And they came in and they said, we really want to adopt X, Y, and Z. And the issue wasn't even really important. When they started to talk about the issue, there was a couple of things that were critically missing. Number one, that we already had laws and ordinances on the books that directly spoke to their issue. They had no idea about those. Number two, when they came in, the first question out of one of the trustees' mouth was, how many people is this affecting? And the response was, well, we're not sure. Okay. The second question that was asked was, how is this, what kind of impact is this having? If we're not sure how many people, like how impactful is this? Well, there's, it affects some people and it doesn't affect other people. That is not sufficient for you. They were really, really passionate. I remember because, it was emotional and everything else, but at the end of the day, they didn't have the preparation necessary to be able to influence that other side. They didn't have facts. There are more than 62% of the people in this township that are affected by blight issues. If we don't do something to address the blight issues now, the blight issues will actually be larger year after year. They'll grow exponentially, which means whatever position that we put into it now is going to save us money in the long term, because if we don't invest into these things, it gets more and more each year that we ignore it. This is why we need to take action now. And being able to communicate that effectively is much more persuasive in our strategy. Keep it simple, okay? We saw a very good example of this. People reduce things that are complex. COVID, a novel coronavirus, something that people haven't seen before. Oh, it's like the flu. No, not really. It's not like the flu. There's a whole host of different things that make this slightly different. But the complexity of it, people reduce that and simplify it. So when you're creating an advocacy message, by you investing a small $10 contribution, you can save a family's life for 6 months. Versus if I made that pretty complicated, by investing $10, we're able to send a net over to sub-Saharan Africa that is put through an entire ecosystem of different people that can help them to install this and place this into the households that are needed. And that housing ultimately keeps mosquitoes out and protects the family. And it has an efficacy of between 4 and 6 months. And you've lost me. You can save a life $10 by housing people and protecting them from mosquitoes by purchasing a Nothing But Net sponsorship. Is that something that you would be willing to help us with today? Nice and simple. If they want more information, be prepared to give them more information. But however simple the message you can be, that's what gets us into sound bites. That's what gets other people to pick up our message, to be able to communicate our message. If it's complex, other people can't repeat it either. And that becomes a huge challenge. Be passionate and persistent. You're going to get told no. You're going to get a door slammed in your face. You're going to get people that give you the runaround. You're going to get manipulated. You're going to have every negative experience, because however passionate you are, it is going to be, if everybody agreed with it, well, then it would already be done. But unfortunately, that's not the way the world works. So we have to kind of generate a little bit of resilience. Being passionate and knowing all of the different reasons why I'm engaged on this or why this matters is a way for us to stay persistent. Because every time we get our teeth kicked in, we get up and we say, I'm doing this because it matters. And this is why it matters to me. That's how we build those resistance, those micro resistances that we need in order to be effective. Plan for small wins. Okay, we all want to change the entire scope of the world. That's great, but we have to do that sometimes one bite at a time. So if I am able to get a small win, maybe I educate somebody today, maybe I educate them and empower them to change their behavior. Maybe I educate them, empower them to change their behavior, and influence them to change their behavior the next time. Maybe I educate, empower, and influence them to change their behavior and to join my advocacy campaign and help spreading that message. Get the small wins and get people excited about it. Campaigns that have small wins keep the energy going, the inspiration going. When we're not getting a small win, or when we're not getting any kind of wins, well, that leads to burnout inside of those advocacy campaigns. Be opportunistic and creative, okay? Have some agility. Never know what you want so much that you would forego taking something better. Never know what you want so much that you would forego taking something better. Let me give you an example. That EPA grant that we did, initially when we went in there, we wanted to do an awareness campaign. We wanted to bring this attention, and we wanted to essentially establish a regulatory scheme that couldn't be done again, or that the abatement process would be done in a different way. During that meeting was when they were like, well, what about if we did something like abatement grants in order to be able to fund some of the cleanup of this? Yes, that's exactly what we're advocating for today. Is that something that you would be willing to entertain with us? Never know what you want so much that you're not willing to take something better. And that's a critical piece, being agile. If you start to see the conversation going in a direction, being agile, taking a small win sometimes and kind of going along. Yes, coalition is huge in the resiliency, right? We can pick each other up. If I'm advocating and I'm starting to lose because I'm coming at it from a corporate angle, well, maybe it's time to empower some of the other of the coalition that's going to connect better with churches or with people. So that's absolutely a great point. And never give up. I love it, Bart. Absolutely. So look for the good in others. This is, again, getting into that tactical empathy. One of the ways in which we actually were very successful with the human trafficking campaign is we went back through the senators and the representatives' records, and we were looking for laws that they voted on that were pro-women, that were pro-rights, that were pro-children, that were pro like assistance in the world of narcotics, because there's a huge connection between human trafficking and forced narcotics, not necessarily just drug use, but forced narcotics. So we went back and looked through their voting records. And then when we walked in, we said, we already know that you're on the side of women in this debate because you advocated and voted on these 3 policies, which were super empowering. This is just like those. Now we reference that. You're just being consistent with your behavior. There's a psychological concept called consistency. We want to be consistent with ourselves. We want to have that authenticity. If we know how they did something in the past, that gives us an advantage to get them to do something similar in the future. If you do that research, even if you don't like the senator, because I'll tell you, there was a number of those senators that I walked in that I just absolutely did not like. And I walked in and I looked at them and I said, I really appreciate everything that you did on this question. It was amazing. I watched you. I watched your reports. I actually read your dossier that came out afterwards, and I thought it was brilliant. If I ever caught that same person in an alleyway and could get away with it, I might slap them once or twice. But you know what? The thing that I'm advocating for is above my own personal feelings. I have to find the good in the other person, connect with it, and connect my message to that good. Because even if personally we don't get along or agree, I can still utilize that influence message to affect the behavior change. And that's critical because my passion, my cause is higher than my feelings or my ego to say, I can't give this person a compliment or identify something good that they did. That's tactical empathy too. Maintain a positive attitude. If you come in, now too often advocacy campaigns get labeled complainer, get labeled aggressive, get labeled all kinds of really, really negative things. One of the most powerful, if people like you, they'll do business with you. If they don't like you, they'll give you the nod, the head shake, and they're never going to answer their phone again. So when we maintain a positive attitude, a liking, a partnership, now we don't necessarily have to always like, but we have to have a cooperative, collaborative, liking relationship in order to conduct business together. So maintaining a positive attitude, you know what, if I walked in and they said, you know, that's not an issue that I can take on this time, slamming my hands on the table and yelling at them is not going to change their mind. I look and I say, okay, well, how might I be able to influence you to reconsider this? And I ask a how question, but I'm going to ask it in a very positive way. I might even use late night FM radio voice, like a negotiation tactic, Chris Voss style. Really, how would you look at this then? And try to get them to open up or give me a little bit more information. And if they give me something where they're just hardlining, I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to meet with you today. You know, even though we didn't necessarily get to be on the same, the same vision or the same track, I really think that this was a productive and positive conversation. I'd love to have a conversation with you again in the future when maybe things change a little bit. Would that be all right? Great, because I'm coming back, because I'm resilient, and you just gave me the green light because you like me. Build rapport, maintain rapport. Advocacy change is all about building and fostering relationships. And pretty much everything that I've said previously is really building into that. So this is one of the most important pieces. If people like you, they'll do business with you. They'll be influenced by you. If they don't like you, or if you come across as the aggressive, the whiny, the frustrated, the so on and so forth, you're not going to get as far with your campaign. You can be passionate and professional. Opportunities. So we have strategy. Here's opportunities. Tune in, research your advocacy, find your local newspaper, website, and set it as your homepage. If you're looking for opportunities to advocacy, Google, I love Google Alerts. I set up Google Alerts. Anytime anything in that 2014 cycle, anytime anything human trafficking came up, I had a Google Alert set that I got a notification anywhere on the web. And I amassed and compiled all of those different articles and concepts. Then now I have a whole host of things, right? Watch the news. It's going to give you places to tap into current events. How does this affect my cause? After each news report, ask that question. Visit other movement websites. Find out. Read past letters to the editor, talking points, op-eds, events. All of these are going to give you an opportunity to think through your own cause and be able to maybe apply tactics that have been successful elsewhere or behaviors that have been successful elsewhere. Bart, I see your question. I'm going to answer that in just a moment. Great question, persistent negativism. So don't let me forget to answer that. I will come right back to that. Write it up, publish your advocacy. A lot of times we think about advocacy as having to speak, but in many cases, posting a response on behalf of your issue, whether that's on a blog or a LinkedIn article or anything else, comments page, that can be pushing your advocacy. Remember, sometimes, especially when you're pushing back against an oppositional force, you may not be trying to convince that opposition. You might be trying to convince all of the people that are around and that are seeing that opposition. We're checking sometimes the negativity or the opposition. We're not trying to necessarily win them in a fight. A Democrat is not going to change the Republican. They're not going to do that. But what are they doing? They're fighting for all of the independents or the swing votes. They're trying to advocate. So even though they're arguing with each other, they're really trying to persuade the people that are around that. Create a social networking page, build your influence and publish your advocacy on that social networking page. Write a letter to the editor. That's huge. I mean, if you can get a letter to the editor in something like the New York Times or to one of your major national news outlets, think about the reach that you have with your advocacy, your cause, especially if you're able to put simple little things in there that people could do to maybe change their behaviors. Then obviously there's speaking out. You can set a table up outside of a university or in the community or outside of a business and talk to people, ask for pledges, ask for engagement. You can schedule a media event. This is what a lot of people think when they think about advocacy is big media events and cameras and news flashes and so on. It doesn't even have to be something that large. If you can get a passionate reporter to take up your cause or to build a relationship with the media, your voice gets amplified thousands of fold by building that relationship. Give a presentation. Take your concept, go to schools and give a presentation to high school students. Go to your local community club. Set up something at the library. Give an awareness presentation. Do it on Zoom. Do it here, wherever else. Publish that. Give those opportunities for people to engage and learn or to ask questions. So these are different ways in which we can speak out. By the way, I'm happy to share all of these slides with you. So however we can do that afterwards, Sababa, Rike, we can get that out to any of the attendees as well. All right. So we're going to skip over this in the interest of time and look at tactics. Prepare an elevator pitch. Sometimes you only get 30 seconds. Sometimes you get 15. In reality, you have about 3 seconds to make them like you, and maybe you have 15 seconds of their attention for you to pitch your cause. This is why we got to keep it simple and precise, but prepare that elevator pitch to be able to give exactly what you're looking for. Structure your story. This is one that when I was vice president, we did a lot of work on narrative, especially when it comes to pitching, especially when it comes to advocacy. But this is a very common way that we structure our story. Right now, what we're finding is there's not enough food at the food pantries. And the challenge with that is that kids are going to sleep at night with empty stomachs and hunger. That affects their education, that affects their moods, that impacts the parents. The parents are oftentimes not eating to try to put whatever it is in there. We need to make sure that there's food available to these and food sustainability. So one of the things that we're pitching right now is a community garden. And what we'd like to get from you is your support in either financial or physical contributions to help us make this a reality and to make sure that children don't go to bed with an empty stomach. That's a simple, yeah, I do love my community garden, Carl. We raised $15,000 in roughly about a week and a half by that narrative. We got the fire department to engage and they built all of our boxes. We got the police department to engage. They helped us build our fences. We got the school district to donate the entire set of property to us. We got the township to donate another set of property to us. The fire department watered it because we used this problem, the pain point that it causes, and the easy solution to be able to get that in there. So that's something, and to teach people food sustainability. It's a simple narrative that you can use for your own advocacy cause because people will connect with that story. It's hugely impactful. Relevant and local data, I talked about this. It's got to mean something to the person that you're advocating to. If you are in Iceland and you're trying to advocate for anti-firearm laws in the United States, you've got to connect with me on why in Iceland, why we should listen, because it's a different culture, or why that would impact, how does that impact you, how does that impact the world, and so on and so forth. But using relevant local data here would be the only way to influence, say, somebody that's a diplomat from the United States. You're going to need to use data and relevant local data that affects that person individually. Get them to laugh. I know this sounds funny, but if you can get a laugh out of the person that you're advocating with, when we laugh, something actually triggers in our brain and we become, this is something that has been founded in neuroscience, we actually become 31% smarter. That's, again, a statistic that comes from the neuroscientific studies of Chris Voss and the negotiations of Black Swan. But it's brilliant. When we get people to laugh, they like us. It's a social thing when we see that smile or that engagement. But when we can make them laugh, it makes them lower their guard. It also makes us smarter. It makes the neurons fire faster. It's something that can truly have an impact. So when we think about, obviously, when we're talking about mental health, we don't want to use an inappropriate joke or something of that nature. We want to maybe, engage the person. Getting a laugh doesn't mean telling a joke, but it may just mean making a joke about something that is completely unrelated and then walking into your advocacy, making them feel good about themselves or something of that nature and getting them to giggle or laugh or so on, and then walking into your advocacy. If you can get them to laugh, you're going to win a lot more. Ask them. This is one of my favorite tactics. What would make you want to support changing the laws in the state of Michigan to be more targeted towards the people that are doing the trafficking than the prostitutes that are getting picked up currently? Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd have to see some of the data on this. Excellent, great. So here's some of the data that shows you the archaic laws of Michigan going back to the 1960s, where these different things. This is the arrest rate. This is the blah, blah, blah rate. This is the actual acquisition rate. Is that what you're looking? Is there anything else that would help you to make this decision? No. Okay, good. Thank you. We win. What would make you want to support? Asking that question, they're going to give you the answer of how you can argue to them. And it's such a simple way for us to know what they're going to be passionate about and how do we tie our advocacy into that message. But again, you have to be prepared with your facts. Aggressive versus reasonable. Okay, this is a binary. When we think about something like Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the things that has been said over the course and studied in the course of social movements is that when you have one that is a reasonable party and you have another faction that is more aggressive, the system, the establishment, the power structures, the elite will be more willing to accommodate the reasonable person. So this is the same thing of, hey, listen, you're probably going to want to work this situation out with me, because I'll tell you, if my partners get involved, they are so much more strict than I am. So let's see if we can maybe come to an agreement ourselves. It's the other person is worse. We want to see if we can come here together. Reasonable versus aggressive, that binary. That's something that you actually see with some of the protests right now, is that the protests, they label certain ones aggressive or terrorist or so on and so forth. There are other actual protest groups that are benefiting from Black Lives Matter getting commodified by essentially right-wing discourse. There are other groups that are getting access to people that didn't have access before. That is actually a functional structure of social movements, and it's been that way pretty much since human existence. Tactical analogy, make it relatable. I'm going to give you an example of this, along with metaphor. One of the things that I tried to do to teach white people about white privilege is to give them, especially in the United States, is to give them a metaphor that they can understand. Long time ago, there was a baseball player by the name of Mark McGwire, was winning home run derby after home run derby after home runs, winning all the time, right? One of the biggest hitters. And nobody really realized it, but they were on steroids. And for a long time, Mark was the #1 home run hitter in the league. And then they found out that he was on steroids. If I just started taking steroids, am I going to be the best home run hitter in the world? Absolutely not. Still have to work, still have to practice, still have to do this, right? But having the steroids is an advantage, even if you can't see them, even if you don't know that they're there. So in this world that we do, and we still have to work hard, we still have to try, we still have to focus, but having white privilege is an advantage that's not visible, that we don't know is there, unless we're the ones that are literally injecting ourselves. So we need to take a look at that and say, what is that advantage, even if it's invisible? Using that metaphor gives the opportunity for somebody to connect, to see it in a different light than maybe they wouldn't have necessarily seen it before. Behavioral congruence, this is one of the last ones, and then I'm going to stop sharing and answer any questions. But behavioral congruence, that's where we utilize that tactic of saying, you were consistent on all of these different past things. You wouldn't want to break that record, would you? I noticed that Starbucks really cares about education, and you fund your employees, you do this, you provide these. You wouldn't want to see somebody get left behind, would you, on the educational front? Would you be willing to help us advocate and to support this initiative that makes sure that people in these lower socioeconomic areas also get those same opportunities that you've advocated for? That's behavioral congruence, tying it to something they've already done. When we have that, people want to be congruent. So that is ultimately the tactics that go along with this. So to wrap up, we've looked at messaging. We've looked at strategy. We've looked at planning. We've looked at the way that these things do. By looking and planning this out, we're going to be able to explain how the person that we're advocating to might react. We're going to be able to predict that a little bit better than maybe before. Once we can predict that, once we have that explanation, that gives us the opportunity to put together an influence message that's going to resonate right on time, right on market. And then once we can influence, we also need to make sure that we still can maintain and manage control of ourselves, because people are going to say stupid things. People are going to frustrate us. People are going to tell us no. But we need to be able to control ourselves and control our emotions in order to advocate effectively for the passionate causes that we have. So I'm hoping that you were able to pick up at least a couple of tactics today, a couple of ideas from different stories or different things that will help you to be a more effective advocate as you launch and continue to launch your campaigns with society, with government, and with business. So I want to say thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be with you today and to talk about something that I'm obviously very, very passionate about. This is it's kind of my jam. I love it. So I want to open up to any questions, and I am going to answer Bart's question about the persistent negativism. Bart, I do want to ask a question from you on your question. The negativism, are you talking about people the external people rejecting your idea, or are you talking about internal frameworks like negativism from inside of the campaign? Or can you give me a clarification, because I want to make sure that I answer your question specifically? Both. Okay, perfect. So how do you handle negative rejection, that negative mindset? Let's look at something like climate change. If you think back, we're 20 years ago, Al Gore, and I'm going to say this from the United States, Al Gore was advocating that climate change was real, that our consumption of fossil fuels was having a huge impact, that that we needed to change the way that we behave in order to have essentially a sustainable globe, right? Al Gore got his teeth kicked in every single day. Science at that time was pushing against him. Scientists were coming out, no, volcanoes will do that, and this, and it's natural, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. 20 years later, which may seem like an incredibly long time, but 20 years later, the science has caught up. The advocacy has been effective. We've started to see behavior change. We're still way, 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 way far off from where we need to go. And we need to look at it and say that as a society, we need to take the environment from multiple different angles, right? Look at any social movement. It didn't create changes overnight. It didn't create changes. It's the ones that have the resiliency to say, okay, the science, these different scientists are pushing back on me right now. Who should I be advocating then to? Let's go to the universities. I'm not getting any headway with law. I'm not getting any headway with the Republican Party. I'm not even getting that much support from the Democratic Party at this point in time. Let's go to the universities. Let's go to the people that are studying ecosystems. Let's go to the biologists. Let's start talking to them. And that's exactly what they did. And they started to have those conversations until the coalition of science really started to have an impact. And then after that, now let's start talking to the media. When you're encountering that resistance, that negativity, that constant, don't beat your head against the wall. Ask yourself, why is this strategy not working? And how can I change the game to maybe influence somewhere else? Because I don't necessarily have to change the law right away if I can start to build that coalition even on the ground floor. Okay, so that's going to be one of the main things is social movements. Change is hard. I mean, there's entire degrees on change management. Change is hard. We have to look at it and say, we're playing a long game here. And sometimes we may not even feel like we don't have time to play the long game. Different things are going to come up. Opportunities are going to come up. They always do. They really always do. So we just have to be reactive to those. From the internal side of things, that's the small wins strategy. Okay. When there's negativity on the inside, when people are losing their motivation, they're losing their inspiration, usually it's because we're not getting anywhere with what we're doing. We're off point, we're off message, whatever that might be. Again, that small strategic shift, that small change. Okay, well, maybe we've been trying to take this on at the state and the state is not ready for this. So let's go start winning the counties. Okay, well, maybe the counties aren't ready for this. Let's go start winning the local municipalities. They're so much easier to get to. I can get to this local person. I can get to this local person. Maybe I can get some businesses to buy into this. But start getting those small wins and amplify the voice of those wins. Because when you win, the next win is easier. When you win, people want to join a winning movement. People want to join something that's creating change. So when you feel that negativity or that persistent negativity that's on the inside, the idea is to get those small wins and change the direction of the organization or the strategy and approach. Other questions? And did I miss any? Make sure here. Well, if you do have any questions, I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find there. Connect with me on LinkedIn, send me an email, reach out. If you're thinking about your advocacy campaigns or how you want to approach them, I would love to have a conversation with you. And that's something that I do, not just for JCI members, but people that are passionate about causes, especially the ones that you identified. These are the things that I'm pretty passionate about. So I'm happy to talk with you about strategy, answer any other questions. Please, by all means, connect with me. Feel free to reach out. And I really do hope that all of you are successful, because the more successful you are in your local community and your country, the more successful that I can be in my community and my country. And as we build those coalitions for the different rights, for the different opportunities for sustainability, that's the global coalitions that we need and the global mindset that we need. So thank you for being here with me today. Savava, I will turn it over to you, or Rike, if you guys have any closing comments or if there's anything that you want to say. Absolute pleasure. Thank you, guys. It was so good to see all of you.
Thank you as well, Jay. It was very lovely. I learned so much today. And thank you, everyone, for participating in the webinar. Soon I will start advertising the next. I just have to fix the time. So we'll hear from you soon. Thank you.
Good night, friends. Take care and hope to talk to you soon.